Okay, this video is about the story of civilization written by Will Durant. And it's an enormous series of books, most of them between 600 and 900 pages long. Now, I consider this kind of adult education. If you read this before college, I would really not recommend it. It's an enormous amount of time it takes. I read it at a leisurely rate. I enjoyed reading at my own pace, whereas in college, I ended up hating a lot of subjects. The speed at which you had to learn really repulsed me. It took me about a year to get through it. I started in January of this year and I ended in December of this year. Now, Will Durant has a different method of writing history. He was trained as a philosopher. He decided that the way that he would approach philosophy is to study of history as philosophy. So studying and writing about history is his philosophy, story of civilization. There are a lot of facts. He has a certain criteria and process of how he writes about history, and I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. What I'm going to do is I underline a lot of things in the books. I don't like underlining things in books. This is almost the only book I ever underlined things in, but there's so many little valuable things that I enjoy when I was reading that just gave me such pleasure that I had to underline it. Now these books, they're pretty common to find in used bookstores. They don't cost a lot, so underlining is not going to diminish the value of the book. I'm going to spend like 3 minutes on each book. I'm going to read you some of the things that I underlined when I read the book. And you get a flavor of how Durant approaches history, what the story of civilization is. Hopefully that'll inspire you to pick one of them up or read all of them like I did. When we're with Durant, we're studying history. The convention in his book is to have a map on each book on the inside front cover and inside back cover, and that helps you with, because he mentions a lot of cities and the boundaries, and they're all as clear as you can get it on the map. The first book is our Oriental Heritage, where Durant begins in Egypt, covers the Near East and the Far East. Now, one of the great things is he sets out some criteria that he's going to use throughout the story of civilization. And I want to go over that because he's very disciplined in capturing these same things throughout this multi-decade project. He says there's 8 elements of a civilization. We're going to go through all these civilizations and like a ladder, step by step, we're going to cover all these things in each civilization. The first element of civilization is labor, tillage, industry, transport, and trade. The second element of civilization is government, the organization and protection of life and society through the clan and the family, law and the state. The third element is morality, customs, manners, conscience, and charity. The fourth element is religion. The fifth element is science. The sixth element is philosophy. The seventh element is letters, literature, poetry. The eighth element is art. So he's going to cover all these in each civilization, and we're going to get a flavor for each civilization, the strength, weaknesses, the things that some are good in one part of one of these elements and some are bad in one of these, and these elements represent the civilization. In the Egyptian religion, the emphasis is rather on reciting the prayers than on living a good life. The Egyptians fell just short of the decimal system. They had no zero. From the Epic of Gilgamesh, which, I'm probably not going to read that, but I don't mind reading a little section of it that Will Durant has selected. Here he says, "Give attention, my friend, and understand my thought. Men exalt the work of the great man who is skilled in murder. They disparage the poor man who has done no sin. They justify the wicked man whose fault is grave. They drive away the just man who seeks the will of God. They let the strong take food of the poor. They strengthen the mighty. They destroy the weak man. The rich man drives him away." We have to learn the same things over and over. But if you read history, these are the patterns of history. Here's David in the Bible. David is merely a masterpiece of literary creation, for there's no contemporary mention of these personalities outside the Bible. He respects religion, and he goes over religion, and he gives religion a central spot in civilization. He talks about what it is and what the strengths are and what the weaknesses are. That's the first one, our Oriental Heritage. The second volume is The Life of Greece. He starts at Crete, heroic age. He does Sparta, does Athens, the Golden Age, 1480 BC to 399 BC, the Golden Age of Greece. One of the sad parts about Greek civilization is that only a very small part of it is handed down to us. They had so much art that we never get to see, so it's really sad. Greece continued to rank its painters as high as its sculptors and architects, perhaps higher. It paid them American commissions and told 1,000 fond stories of their lives. We hardly have any Greek painting. I don't even know. I'm tempted to say we don't have any. And of course, the Greeks held statuary very high as an art form. And then he goes into Greek science. One of the great things is determining the circumference of our planet. Theophrastus, who was a gardener, he divided all plants into trees, brushes, shrubs, and herbs, distinguished the chief parts of a plant as the root, the stem, the branch, the twig, the flower, the fruit. Classification of plants, which is a central part of the system of botany. Herophilus of Chalcedon, he distinguished arteries from veins, discovered circulation of the blood, 19 centuries before Harvey. You know, all these interesting little facts. If you like that, you're going to be happy reading Will Durant. Okay, and then in the back of the book, he always has a bibliography, so you can read a lot of other books that he mentions in the volume. The next volume of the Will Durant, Story of Civilization, is Caesar and Christ. On the maps, on this one, he has the map of ancient Rome on the front inside cover, and on the back cover, he has Italy, ancient Italy and Sicily. This is just the whole volume on just one area of the world, because it was so powerful what was going on there. He opens up Hannibal against Rome, Stoic Rome, the Greek conquest, the agrarian revolt. He talks about the millionaires, Crassus, who was one of the wealthiest men in Rome. He talks about women. And here it is, men chose wives or had wives chosen for him to get a rich dowry. So he consistently talk about marriage and relationships through all the volumes. And in this one he's saying, men made choices. It's a business thing. The man marries for the money he's going to get. The woman, it sounds like, didn't have much choice. Pompey, Cicero. Then we talk about Antony and Brutus. Antony was one half of what Caesar had been, and Augustus would be the other half. Antony was a good general, Augustus a superlative statesman. So Durant can go through all this material and summarize it so well in just a few words that's so valuable, because you just have access to this great mind. Anthony and Octavian and that great conflict between those two. Then you have Augustus when he took over, and the Golden Age, the Aeneid, the Silver Age, the great engineering of the Romans. He always tells you the population of what these areas. Belloc estimates the slaves in Rome at 30 BC at 400,000. Nearly half of the population in Italy at 1.5 million. Then he says, if we may believe the table gossipers of Athenius, some Romans had 20,000 slaves. A proposal that the slaves be required to wear a distinctive dress was voted down in the Senate because they might realize their numerical strength. So here he talks about Roman law. And here he has, the man should be held innocent until proven guilty. Then he moves on to Hadrian, the progress of science, and then he finishes up with Christ. So Durant does address the idea that, is Jesus a real figure in history? If Jesus was made up, why would they record many incidents that, like the competition of apostles for high places in the kingdom, their flight after Jesus' arrest, Peter's denial, the failure of Christ to work the miracles in Galilee? Why would they record all those things that are to the detriment of Jesus if it was all made up? And he says that a few simple men should in one generation have invented so powerful and appealing a personality as Jesus, so lofty in ethic and so inspiring a vision of human brotherhood, that in itself would be a miracle far more incredible than any recorded in the Gospels. He also says, experience suggests that an old tradition must not be too quickly rejected. Our ancestors were not fools. Durant says, Caesar hoped to reform men by changing institutions and laws. Christ wished to remake institutions and lessen laws by changing men. Jesus' mind was a type frequent among Jews, penetrating and passionate rather than genial and urbane, emotional and imaginative rather than objective and impartial. He was powerful in action because he was narrow in thought. And a little bit about the fall of the Roman Empire. It was because Rome was already dying that Christianity grew so rapidly. Men lost faith in the state, not because Christianity held them aloof, but because the state defended wealth against poverty, fought to capture slave, taxed toil to support luxury, and failed to protect its people from famine, pestilence, invasion, and destruction. Forgivably, they turned from Caesar preaching war to Christ preaching peace, from incredible brutality to unprecedented charity, from life without hope or dignity to faith that consoled their poverty and honored their humanity. Rome was not destroyed by Christianity any more than by barbarian invasion. It was an empty shell when Christianity rose. An economic reason, the inability of Italian industry to export the equivalent of Italian imports, and the consequent drain of precious metals to the East, the depreciation of its currency, the discouragement of ability, and the absorption of investment capital by confiscatory taxation. There's a lot of reasons. The Romans lost interest in government and became absorbed in his business, his amusements, his legion, or his individual salvation. The governments no longer attracted first-rate men. The next volume is The Age of Faith. This is a particularly large one. This one is about 1,000 pages. He talks about Boethius here, which is a philosopher. It's funny because I love a book called Confederacy of Dunces. The character in there talks about the philosopher Boethius. Byzantine Empire, he talks about, goes into Muhammad here. Durant's summary of Muhammad. If we judge greatness by influence, he was one of the great giants of history. He undertook to raise the spiritual and moral level of the people harassed into barbarism by heat and foodless waste. He succeeded more completely than any other reformer. Seldom has any man so fully realized his dream. He accomplished his purpose through the religion, not only because he himself was religious, but because no other medium could have moved the Arabs of this time. He appealed to their imagination, their fears and hopes, and spoke in terms that they could understand. When he began, Arabia was a desert, flotsam of idolatrous tribes. When he died, it was a nation. He restrained fanaticism and superstition, but he used them. Upon Judaism, Zoroastrianism, and his native creed, he built a religion, simple and clear and strong, and a morality of ruthless courage and racial pride, which in generation marched to 100 victories, in a century to empire, and remains to this day a virile force through half the world. Now, Muhammad believed to have forbidden sculpture and painting as accomplices of idolatry, as Epicurean degeneracy. But they did like architecture, and they do great tile work. Calligraphy is an integral part of illumination. Here's a book of optics by Kitab al-Manzar. Algebra, which we find in the Greek Diophantes in the 3rd century owes its name to the Arabs who extensively developed this detective science. The great figure here was Muhammad ibn Musa, who lived from 1780 to 850. The heart and the mind of the Jew, the Kabbalah. All classes believed in magic, astrology, divination, sorcery, witchcraft, and miraculous amulets. One section I liked here in the Age of Faith was the Adventure into Reason. One of my favorite sections of the whole story of civilization is this one of Thomas Aquinas. He talks about metaphysics. All created beings are both active and passive. They act and are acted upon. Also, they are a mixture of being and becoming. They possess certain qualities and may lose some of these and acquire others. Water may become warmed. Thomas denotes the susceptibility to external action or internal change by the term potentia, possibility. God alone has no potentia or possibility. God cannot be acted upon, and God cannot change. God is actus purus, pure activity, pure actuality. He is already everything he can be. Below God, all entities can be ranged in a descending scale according to their greater possibility. So that's a pretty amazing conception of God. Now he moves into the Byzantine world, and of course one of the main forms of art that's different there is the mosaic. Decline of the West, Christian Spain, the rise of the North, Germany, the Greek Church, the serf, Russia, chivalry. He moves into the Crusades. One of the things in this Islamic scene is he talks about the Shiites and the Sunnis. And that's a conflict that still exists today. One thing I like is he does Rumi as one of the great poets of all time, is Jal-ud-Din Rumi from 1201 to 1273. The next one is the Renaissance from 1304 to 1576. Gets into Petrarch and Boccaccio. The Christian arts are really starting to flourish. The rise of the Medici. Big deal. The Medici is an Italian family that had a lot of influence over history. Goes to Milan. Does Leonardo da Vinci. Very, very good job on Leonardo da Vinci.
He really does an amazing job on capturing the rise and majesty and pageantry of Venice. It's just a wonderful period. Then he goes into the Roman Renaissance and the Borgia family and Julius II, the popes, covers the popes very well. He thoroughly covers the corruption in the Catholic Church. And the painters, Piero della Francesca and Giorgione.
Next one is the Reformation, 1300 to 1564. He starts with the Catholic Church. Does Joan of Arc. Then he gets into Erasmus. And then he gets into Luther. Luther's concept of God was Judaic. No one is by nature Christian or pious. The world and the masses are and always will be unchristian. The wicked always outnumber the good. Henry VIII, Cardinal Wolsey, and then the Church of England. Unification of Russia, the genius of Islam. Oh, there was a great historian from Islam, and his name was Ibn Khaldun. I underline this. The basic conditions of sequences are geographical. Climate exercises a general but basic influence. The cold north eventually produces a white skin, light hair, blue eyes, and a serious disposition. The tropics produce in time dark skin, black hair, dilation of the animal spirits, lightness of mind, gaiety, quick transports of pleasure leading to song and dance. Food affects character. A heavy diet of meats, condiments, and grains begets heaviness of body and mind and quick succumbing to famine or infection. A light diet, such as dessert people eat, makes for agile and healthy bodies, clearness of mind, resistance to disease.
He also says the fiscal policy of a government may make or break a society. Excessive taxation or the entry of government into production and distribution can stifle incentive, enterprise, and competition, and kill the goose that lays the revenues. On the other hand, an excessive concentration of wealth may tear a society to pieces by promoting a revolution.
That comes from this Islamic book called the Muqaddamah.
And here's another passage. History has for its true object to make us understand the social state of man, i.e., his civilization, to reveal to us the phenomena that naturally accompany primitive life, and then the refinement of manners, the diverse superiorities that people acquire, and which beget empires and dynasties, the diverse occupations, professions, sciences, and arts, and lastly, all the changes that the nature of things can effect in the nature of society. From the Muqaddamah by Ibn Khaldun.
Oh, here's a fundamental thing of Durant. Every empire passes through successive phases. A victorious nomad tribe settles down to enjoy its conquest of a terrain or state. 2. Social relations become more complex. A more concentrated authority is required for the maintenance of order. The tribal chieftain becomes king. 3. Wealth grows, cities multiply, education and literature develop. The arts find patrons, science, philosophy lift their heads, advanced urbanization and comfortable wealth mark the beginning of decay. 4. The enriched society becomes to prefer pleasure, luxury, and ease to enterprise, risk, or war. Religion loses its hold on human imagination or belief. Morals deteriorate. Pederasty grows. The martial virtues and pursuits decline. The mercenaries are hired to defend the society. These lack the ardor of patriotism or religious faith.
The poorly defended wealth invites attack by the hungry, seething millions beyond the frontiers.
5. External attack or internal intrigue, both together overthrow the state. And Rabelais was a satirist. Rabelais never tired of satirizing the scholastic formalities of logical gymnastics of the Sorbonne, the waste of student years and debates carefully removed from actual concern with human life. Quote, I am willing to lose my share of paradise, vowed Clement Marot, if those great beasts, the professors, did not ruin my youth. Here's Peter Bruegel the elder, the painter, great painter. Holbein. Oh, what a great painter Holbein is. Then we move on to Copernicus. Back to science. He goes to science. Now he goes to church and reform. And he ends it here. Let's see if I can find a generalization here. Protestant lands have seen the greatest flowering of science and philosophy, whereas Christian lands are different because they reject science. Anyway, so that ends that one. And that is the Reformation. The next one up is the Age of Reason begins. So he starts off with Queen Elizabeth in Merry England.
Durant says of Queen Elizabeth, she was the greatest ruler that England has ever known. On the playwright Christopher Marlowe, his distorted defect was lack of humor. There is no genial character in his plays. And the incidental comedy does not, as in Shakespeare, serve its proper function in tragedy, to ease the hearer's tension before lifting him to greater tragic intensities. He could appreciate the physical beauty of woman, but not their tenderness, solicitude, and grace. There is no vivid female character in his plays, not even in the unfinished Dido, Queen of Carthage. Will Durant's comments about Shakespeare, about Shylock, and here's what about Shylock. Jews that competent critics still debate whether Shylock is pictured as more sinned against than sinning. About Taming of the Shrew, he says, The taming of the shrew is boisterously incredible. Shrews are never tamed. Durant has a very peculiar way of summarizing Shakespeare. Shakespeare is Shakespeare, pilfering plots, passages, phrases, lines anywhere, and yet the most original, distinctive, creative writer of all time. Most people know that Christopher Marlowe was killed in a duel. And here's an interesting part about Ben Jonson, another playwright who was close with Shakespeare. Ben was hot-tempered, quarreled widely in the year of his first success. He fell out with Gabriel Spencer, an actor, dueled with him, killed him, and was jailed for murder in 1598. He received a fair trial, and he was allowed to plead benefit of clergy because he read the Latin Psalter like a clerk. He was released, but only after having the letter T stamped with a hot tin iron on his thumb so that he might be readily identified as a second offender if he killed again. All the rest of his life, he was branded a felon. Durant goes over the relationship between Ben Jonson and Shakespeare. And here's Thomas Fuller writing about the two men. Many were the wit combats betwixt Shakespeare and Ben Jonson, which two I behold like a Spanish great galleon and an English man of war. Master Jonson, like the former, was built far higher in learning, solid but slow in his performances. Shakespeare, lesser in bulk but lighter in sailing, could turn with all tides, tack about, and take advantage of all winds by the quickness of his wit and invention. When Shakespeare died, Jonson said, I loved the man, this side of idolatry.
James IV of Scotland, who becomes James I of England, who of course oversaw the King James version of the Bible. And then you have Francis Bacon, who's a very interesting character in history. Okay, now he goes back to Spain, golden age of Spanish art, El Greco. Then we move into Galileo, and that ends that one. The Age of Reason begins. And we move on to the next one, which is the Age of Louis XIV. The French Zenith, 1643 to 1715. Zenith in French literature with Racine and La Fontaine and Boileau. So then here's a great summary of this period. There was something artificial in the tragic drama and major arts of the period. They leaned too heavily upon Greek, Roman, and Renaissance models. They took their subjects from an alien antiquity rather than from the history, faith, character of France. They expressed the classical education of an exclusive caste rather than the life and soul of the people. Hence, amid all that gilded galaxy, the plebeian Molière and La Fontaine are the most alive today because they forgot Greece and Rome and remembered France. The classic age cleansed the language, chiseled the literature, gave grace to speech, and taught passion to reason, but also it chilled French and English poetry and for almost a century after the Great Reign. Great summary. Amazing. Then we move to England with Cromwell and Milton, Dryden and Swift, Peter the Great. From Russia, back to science, astronomy. Haley, Christian Huygens. Government, said Locke, has no other end but the preservation of property. Theoretically, no man should have more property than he can use. Here's a summary that I underlined. The Declaration of the Rights of Man in 1789, when the American colonists rebelled against the resurgent monarchy of George III, they adopted the ideas, formulas, almost the words of Locke to express their Declaration of Independence. The rights that Locke had vindicated became the Bill of Rights in the first 10 amendments of the American Constitution. His separation of governmental powers is extended to the judiciary by Montesquieu became the living factor in the American form of government. His solicitude for property passed into American legislation. His essays on toleration influenced the founding fathers in separating church from state and decreeing religious liberty. Rarely in the history of political philosophy has one man had such a lasting influence. John Locke. One thing that Durant, he rates highly a person whose influence goes generation to generation after they die. Some people were very great in their time, but they didn't the ideas that they propounded or the art that they made didn't really influence following generations. In these latter books, the author changes. The beginning books were just Will Durant. At a certain point, his wife Ariel Durant had done so much help with him, researching and writing, that he included her as the author. So they're equal authors on the latter volumes. France was amazing in this period. I'm just flipping through here. The art, though, is really, wow, just such decadent art. Voltaire in France. You also get the distinction of the different nations and their explorers. Like France wasn't really known for colonies, whereas England had a lot of colonies, Spain had colonies, Germany didn't have a lot of colonies. One of his Durant's favorites is Voltaire. He's often just brings up Voltaire. He'll be writing about something and says Voltaire thought this, Voltaire thought that, because Voltaire touched on so many things. But it's really clear that Durant just loves Voltaire, and I grew to like Voltaire because he liked him.
Now we move on to higher education in England. Durant says both Oxford and Cambridge suffered stagnation in this period from conservatism in curriculum, methods, and ideas. Lord Chesterfield described Cambridge as sunk into the lowest obscurity. Oxford clung to the old theology of the fallen Stuart dynasty and allowed no visit from the crude Hanoverian kings. Adam Smith, a student at Oxford in 1745, said that he had learned little there. Edward Gibbon, who studied there in 1752, denounced the Dons as ignorant drunks and regretted the years he had wasted in university. Many families preferred to engage private tutors. Now we move to France. Paris was the cultural capital of the world rather than of France. Those who live 100 leagues from the capital, said Duclos, are 100 years away from it in ways of conduct and thought. The society was brilliant because women were its life. They were the deities it worshipped and set its tone. As men lived less in the camp, more in the capital and at the court, they became increasingly sensitive to the intangible charms of women, grace of movement, melody of voice, vivacity of spirit, brightness of eyes, delicacy of tact, tenderness of solicitude, kindness of soul. These qualities had made women lovable in every civilization. Women knew men better than men knew women. The worship of beauty. Beauty became more than ever a tactile value. Rococo was the art of Epicurean moneyed minority eager to enjoy every pleasure before the disappearance of its fragile world in an anticipated deluge of change. It was a brilliant age because the women in it were brilliant, combining brains and beauty beyond any precedent. It was because of them that the French writers warmed thought with feeling and graced philosophy with wit. Diderot confessed, "Women accustomed us to discuss with charm and clearness the driest of thorniest subjects. We talk to them unceasingly. We wish them to listen. We are afraid of tiring or boring them. Hence we develop a particular method of explaining ourselves easily, and this method passes from conversation into style. Because women, French prose became brighter than poetry, and the French language took on a suave charm, an elegance of phrase, a courtesy of speech that made it delectable and supreme. And because of women, French art passed from the massive bazaars of Baroque to the refinement of form and taste that embellished every aspect of French life." Now we move on to Montesquieu. He There's a long section on him. I'm just going to do a couple of things he said. A moderate government is most agreeable to the Christian religion, and despotic government to the Mohammed religion. The Catholic religion is most agreeable to the monarchy, and the Protestant to the republic. When the Christian religion became unhappily divided into Catholic and Protestant, the people of the North embraced the Protestant, and those of the South still adhered to the Catholic. The reason is plain. The people of the North have, and will forever have, a spirit of liberty and independence, which the people of the South have not.
Durant identifies the importance of reason, and here's Montesquieu. Reason is the most perfect, the most noble, the most beautiful of all our faculties.
Okay, now we're going to move. Here we go on to Bach. Johann Sebastian Bach in Germany. Bach's manual magic, he means his fingering, for he invented a playing technique that called for the use of all the fingers, including the thumb, of each hand, whereas his predecessors had seldom used or required more than the middle three fingers in their compositions for the clavier. Even in the position of the hand he caused a revolution. Players had tended to keep the hand flat in striking the keys. Bach taught his pupils to curve the hand so that all the fingertips would strike the keys at the same level. And we've got to move to the end. Let's wrap this up. He ends with a long section on Voltaire, but here's the summary of Voltaire. But he was a philosopher, if that means a mind seriously occupied with the basic problems of nature, morals, government, life, and destiny. He was not considered profound, but perhaps that was because he was uncertain and clear. His ideas were seldom original, but in philosophy, nearly all original ideas are foolish, and lack of originality is a sign of wisdom. Certainly the form that he gave to us was original. Voltaire is without question the most brilliant writer that ever lived. Was he the second in every field, as Diderot charged? Second in philosophy to Diderot, yes, and in drama to Corneille and Racine. But he was first and best in his time, in his conception of writing of history, of the grace of his poetry, in the charm and wit of his prose, in the range of his thoughts and his influence. His spirit moved like a flame over the continent and the century, and it stirs a million souls in every generation. So that ends the Age of Voltaire.
All right, now we're down to the last two. It goes to Rousseau and the Revolution. Durant develops the character of Voltaire in the story of civilization as a major figure of the mind. And then he brings in the character of Rousseau in this volume, Rousseau and the Revolution. And he's more about feelings. So they have two different philosophies. They lived at the same times. Durant weaves them through the whole period, going back and forth. So thinks one thing, Voltaire thinks one thing, and it's really a great story that he sets up with these two characters. So here's Voltaire criticizing Rousseau. He called Rousseau a clockmaker's boy, a Judas who betrayed philosophy, a madman born of chance mating of Diogenes' dog with that of Aristides. He says, I know how to hate because I know how to love. Voltaire was generous with his money, but he was also very financial astute. The way he made a lot of money was there was a lottery and he bought all the tickets. He won the lottery and kept all that money, and that was part of how he built his fortune. You know, you could look at that and say that's a pretty corrupt thing to do, but he wasn't beyond that. Rousseau says, God is unknowable, but I feel that he is there and everywhere.
So let's get some more of Rousseau's thoughts. Rousseau said, the city is surfeited with men who behave like women and women who itch to be like men. Hereditary aristocracy is the worst of all governments. Elective aristocracy is the best. The best government is one which the laws are made and administered
by a minority of men, periodically chosen for their intellectual and moral superiority. Taxes should fall heavily upon luxuries. Rousseau predicted the revolution. Rousseau says, the crisis is approaching. We are on the edge of revolution, which I consider inevitable. Durant says he was a rebel individualist by temperament, ailment, and lack of formal discipline. He was a communalist, never a communist, not even a collectivist, by his tardy perception that no operative society can be composed of mavericks. Voltaire criticized Christianity while Rousseau criticized the state. And after 1760, the 18th century belonged to Rousseau. Here's a very great sentence by Durant. Voltaire thought in ideas and wrote with epigrams. Rousseau saw in pictures and composed with sensations. Then he goes back to Italy, back to Spain, Casanova. Talks about the Jesuits, the power that they had. They were kicked out of Spain. Haydn, then Mozart. Moves on to Russia, Catherine the Great, Frederick's Germany. Then he moves on to Kant. I was looking forward to Kant, but it wasn't as good as I thought it was going to be. Then he prepares for Weimar, which is where Goethe and Schiller were. Weimar and Flower. Spends a lot. He really likes Goethe. I'm not that big on Goethe. England, the painters, Joshua Reynolds, Thomas Gainsborough. Really enjoyed that. He spends a lot of time on James Boswell and Samuel Johnson. I really enjoyed that. And I read some more books by Boswell and Johnson. But of course, Boswell is a little more entertaining. Samuel Johnson is very entertaining what he writes on him. And he's talking about Johann Christian Bach. Johnson felt that music was being spoiled by digital acrobatics. And hearing a violinist praised because the feats he performed were so difficult, Johnson exclaimed, "Difficult? I wish it had been impossible." He was a great fighter in arguments, a great debater. And here's Oliver Goldsmith wrote, "There's no arguing with Johnson, for if his pistol misses fire, he knocks you down with the butt." So it's very witty stuff here. Of course, Johnson wrote the famous line, "No man but a blockhead ever wrote except for money." And Durant follows that up with, which is understated vanity.
Back in France, there's a great story here about how the Queen Marie Antoinette's reputation was ruined by the scandal of the diamond necklace.
So this ends with the revolution, and so in the previous book they talked about the revolution and how they killed all of the aristocracy. They were just on a killing spree and they didn't know how to stop it. And so kind of Napoleon rose at this period and proved to be such a warrior, but he just kept doing it and going on and on and on and killing and having wars and having these gigantic battles where 30,000 people died, 40,000 people died, and on his side, and that many on the other side. I mean, it was just ridiculous, the amount of war that went on in the period of the Napoleonic years from the beginning of the 1800s. I was looking forward to Napoleon, and to tell you the truth, I don't really like him very much because he was just really selfish, and he ruined the country. Explain, in a way he made it strong because he established that even though they destroyed the monarchy, they were a strong country, but then he became an emperor, so that's just another word for monarchy in another way. Goes through Napoleon. This one is all Napoleon. He just overcomes the area. Whereas in the other one, there's so many different characters that he does for a little bit. This one is just Napoleon dominates, everything. The art's about him, the laws are about him, business is about him, the wars are about him. It's just all about him. There is one section on England where he does the Lake poets, Wordsworth. Then he does Pitt, Nelson in England. He does a little bit on Italy and Austria. He does Beethoven. He does some section on Germany. That's the Age of Napoleon. So that wraps it up. Story of Civilization by Will Durant. I recommend it, and I hope you can make an attempt to read it and see if it appeals to you. So thanks for watching.